Welcome, friends, to a very special evening in which I will be in conversation with the author of a remarkable book. The book is called Sri Aurobindo and the Literary Renaissance of India, and its author is Dr. Pariksith Singh, who is sitting right next to me, albeit in a virtual mode. He's in Florida and I'm in New Delhi. I'm very, very happy to launch this book and have this conversation with Dr. Singh for a number of reasons. But before we actually start talking about this book at some length, I must say that it's a special occasion because a new publishing house has also been launched. It's called Kali. Kali is the imprint, and the house is called Blue One. I'll say a few words about Dr. Singh for those of you who don't know him. He's a prodigy, he's a medical doctor, he's an entrepreneur. He runs a very big medical business in Florida, in the Tampa area. And as I said, he's a genius. He's a prodigy, he's a genius. I'm saying this not to flatter him, he's a dear friend of mine, but with the full assurance of the veracity of my claim. I invite you to read this book because it's an extraordinary book by somebody who's not trained in humanities or in literature, who's actually a medical doctor and a businessman. Because, I have been reading and writing on Sri Aurobindo for more than 40 years. My PhD was on mysticism in Indian English poetry, and it had 2 chapters on Sri Aurobindo. And I can't say that I've read every word by Sri Aurobindo and on Sri Aurobindo because it's a vast literature. It's an ocean of letters. But 35 volumes of the CW essay, the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. Earlier it was SABCL, 30 volumes of the Sri Aurobindo Birth Centenary Library, and literally, I would say 400, 500 books written on Sri Aurobindo. Okay, so it's a vast amount of literature. But I can say I've read a good deal of it and more. And I find that in the last several decades, there's no book of the scope and stature of this particular volume, Sri Aurobindo and the Literary Renaissance of India. I should know because I wrote the foreword to the book, but I'm only going to say a few words before we have this conversation. Now, what is extraordinary about this book? It's in 8 sections and it deals with vast array of topics. Just the first section engages, which is called Sri Aurobindo, the philosopher. It engages with Sri Aurobindo and some of the leading thinkers of the world, going back to Heraclitus and Plato, but it includes Wittgenstein, Husserl, Nietzsche, Sartre, Kant, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, Hegel, Parmenides, Derrida, Heidegger, Huxley, and Buber. So this is only section 1. Then you have Sri Aurobindo, the playwright and the poet, and some of his major works are discussed here, and works which very few people have really talked about at length, like Ilion, or the Vigil of Talleyrand. So these are now there are works which many people have written about, like the Rose of God, Nirvana, or for example, Savitri. But how about Savitri as a play? What is a mantra? And Savitri, the Viziers of Basora. Basora, of course, is a town in Iraq. And it's a play by Sri Aurobindo. How many people have written about the plays of Sri Aurobindo? Dr. Srinivas Iyengar did it, but not many. And then Sri Aurobindo and Tagore, Sri Aurobindo and Yeats, Sri Aurobindo and Herbert. Herbert is a so-called metaphysical poet, a religious poet, belonging to the 17th century. Very few people have compared Sri Aurobindo with Herbert. Then there's Sri Aurobindo and Milton, a logical comparison because Paradise Lost invites us to look at, Savitri invites us to look at Paradise Lost. But then the aphorisms of Sri Aurobindo, a whole section on Sri Aurobindo's aphorisms, section 3, then Sri Aurobindo is the first post-modernist translator. So essays on the Gita and his famous essay on the secret of the Veda, but here the title of the chapter is called Sri Aurobindo, the scandal of the Vedas. Okay. Then section 5, Sri Aurobindo is the greatest and first literary critic of India. You may not want to call him the first literary critic of modern India because his own brother Manomohan Ghosh wrote some substantial literary criticism. But the future poetry is an extraordinary work, and perhaps I'm going to ask you about that very soon. But the future poetry of Sri Aurobindo, where he looks at canonical British literature from an entirely different point of view. Then, on quantitative meter, section 6, very few people understand what quantitative meter is because the normal rhythm of the English verse is based on the number of feet. Okay, like an iamb has 5 feet, trochee has 4 feet, and then stress, anapest, and so forth. So, but quantitative meter takes us back to Greek poetry. Okay, so very few people know about it, and Dr. Pariksith Singh, who is a medical practitioner, has written exhaustively about it here. Then, section 7, the prose of Sri Aurobindo. Okay, the story of an artist as a young man reminds us of Joyce. The portrait of an artist as a young man. And the final section, Sri Aurobindo, the future of India, where he talks about the Uttarpada speech and the literary awakening. That's a very short last chapter. But one of the things I wanted to say before I open it up and have this conversation is that I really enjoyed reading this book. And I was reading it as, a reader would installments. Some of the greatest writings in the English language have come in installments. Dickens's major novels, were published in installments, starting from the Pickwick Papers. Tolstoy's War and Peace came in installments. Tagore's Gora came in installments. So I was astonished at the fecundity of Dr. Pariksith Singh and his literary output. I try to read and write almost every day, but I think nobody can match him. Every week I was getting this chapter to read, and it was exhilarating. And the thing is, Sri Aurobindo has been considered very difficult by readers. But I can assure you, every chapter here is readable. And I was just waiting for the next installment. So, without further ado, congratulations, Dr. Singh, on this magnum opus. You've been a poet, you've written on medical matters as well. And I know you do seminars teaching people, how to handle, insurance and a variety of things in the medical profession. I know you run a very important company. But everyone will be curious to know what were the circumstances which made you write this extraordinary book?
I was, thank you, Makaranji. I mean, I'm speechless because, your book is the one I used to read when I was came to the US. This is the book that I had. My connection with Sri Aurobindo was this book, which was an amazing collection and selection of his writings. And 1993, when I came to the US, this was my companion. I couldn't bring all my books. So it's quite, humbling and so such a moment of pride that today I'm talking to the man whose book I used to read to read Sri Aurobindo, to get to Sri Aurobindo. And but it taking Sri Aurobindo at any level is such an experience as if you are beholding the Himalayas or you're taking a dip in the Indian Ocean. It's such a vast field. And really, we have been, at least personally, I've been kind of reluctant to write about him because he's so vast. And your point about installments is so valid because that's the only way I could write about him. Just take one little thing and write about just that with a complete focus. Because if I would try to look at the whole entire oeuvre, I would not be able to hold it. I can tell you, it's such a vast, vast field and range. So I took one aspect of his literary persona or personality, and then wrote about them. Last year, end of October, November, I was very ill with COVID, and it was a very trying time. And it's kind of in those moments, this was kind of the writing kind of resuscitated me, kept me going. And we're still going through the epidemic, the pandemic of COVID, which is a horrendous experience for us physicians. So I guess a lot of that pain, the suffering, kind of got sublimated, if I may use a Freudian word, which Sri Aurobindo might not have liked, but transformed. Right, the energy got transformed into an attempt to write about him. And any attempt to write about the Himalayas is only going to be a puny attempt. You write about Indian Ocean, what are you going to describe? But the way I approached, what I felt was his genius has not been fully recognized even by the Indians, by the literary writers, critics. We have failed him. And all that we look at in modern literary criticism is criticism of one poem, one epic poem of his, which is the Savitri. Nobody talks about his contributions in, say, the innovations in the prosody. Nobody talks about his minor epics. Nobody talks about his literary criticism. And what about his philosophy? It is so vast. I mean, if you just look at the Life Divine, or if you look at his massive work on the supramental manifestation, or the Mother, these are vast synthetic darshanas. And if we may use the word, in management we say culture always takes strategy for lunch, right? Culture eats strategy. Here I would say darshana takes philosophy for lunch. All these different philosophers with mental great abstractions, speculations, and here we have a great yogi just writing about his darshana, what he's seeing. And all these philosophies come like minor currents into his ocean. And that's what I wanted to show. We talk about Plato, and Plato talked about the philosopher king. He was frustrated with the world at that time. He wanted to change the society. He even tried to get into politics. He tried to reach out to the kings and try to change them. He failed. The philosopher king is still a limited ideal when we take the Indian ideal, which is the ideal of Janaka, or the yogi who is the leader. And so that is much bigger, much comprehensive, and his contribution to that thought, the Gnostic community, Gnostic beings who will be the forebearers of future humanity's ascent or evolution. So his philosophy, we could go on for hours and hours, and you have written so much about him. But to tell our young readers if he is not difficult, he is vast. That is the challenge with him. He everything, Vedanta, Tantra, Vishisht Advaita, Vaishnava Bhakti, Sankhya, Yoga. I mean, the only equivalent in philosophy that I can see for him is Sri Krishna, who took all the movements and created one synthetic, vast synoptic vision. And to call it even a philosophy is kind of limiting, because philosophy is just love of knowledge. I have nobody touches that range, not even Plato. Maybe Shankaracharya with his brilliant, with his genius. So just understanding him as a philosopher, him as a literary critic, would be a great growth for us. We will come so far ahead just by understanding what he has done for us. And I'm not even touching what he did for India in the political field, which as I'm reading more and more, I'm astounded. If you read the lives of Sri Aurobindo, just 2-3 years he was in the political field, but he gave a decisive turn to India's independence, and people don't realize it. Without it, Congress would not have adopted in 1929 the goal of Swaraj. Without him pushing the buttons and pushing the envelope, as it were, nobody would have picked up on it, because everyone was afraid of saying it. Nobody even believed it was possible in that Pax Britannica. Who would think that this powerful imperialist power, this that India could beat them. Nobody could have thought it was possible. He made us realize it was not only possible, but that is our dharma. That is our religion. So such a forceful, clear vision. I have not seen anywhere with that vastness and that gentleness to adopt everyone, almost a syncretic approach. Everyone comes into him naturally. I think that if we understand, then my humble contribution to our amazing teachers, that's how it, I'm sorry, I'm talking, but I can go on about his genius and vision.
No, that's extraordinary. I was struck by two, three things you said, and perhaps you can elaborate on them. See, first of all, this is a Corona book, okay? In other
Yes.
words, Corona Kal ka Kamal, I would call it. Corona Kal ka Kamal, since you're a Hindi poet as well. Why am I saying it? See, you yourself are a healer. I know that your, medical office, which has maybe 400, 500 doctors, have saved countless lives in Florida. I know because you've been telling me. But you yourself had corona and you were gasping for breath yourself. And look at the, grace of the divine play that the healer was healed not necessarily through modern biomedicine, but by writing a book in which the energy and transformative power of the guru was channeled. So, if you can just tell us about that, your struggle, and how you were able to, despite the fatigue and the other symptoms, produce these chapters week by week. And a kind of subsidiary question, which touches on your point about darshana, taking philosophy to lunch. I would say it's actually lunching on philosophy. Now, each of these philosophers you've juxtaposed with Sri Aurobindo because it's a juxtaposition. You make them talk to each other across the barriers of time and culture and continent. So it's an extraordinary imaginary dialogue. Now, you had to absorb Sri Aurobindo and absorb these difficult philosophers. I mean, I know people take a lifetime just to study Wittgenstein and they don't even, scratch the surface of Tractacus or something. So, I mean, it's mind boggling to me. Here you're recovering or trying to, recover from COVID, and every week you're producing a chapter where you're making Sri Aurobindo talk to these philosophers who produced vast quantities of literature. You mentioned Plato. Look at Plato's works. So, how did you do that? I think it's a feat that's extraordinary.
So let me come to the second question first, then I'll go to Corona, because Corona, but see, I could understand these complex philosophers, Wittgenstein, Derrida. They are not easy. You read On Grammatology by Derrida and you'll pull your hair out. But you read, so my friends who would read James Joyce, and I'm not even talking about the Ulysses or the Finnegan's Wake. I'm talking about earlier works, Dubliners and the writer as a young man, the portrait of an artist as a young man. Most people would not understand. My friends could not understand it. To me, it was natural because stream of consciousness was easy. Because what? I had read Sri Aurobindo. I was practicing. I was looking at the mind, how the mind moves. I was studying the jump of the thoughts. So stream of consciousness was like kids' play to me. There was nothing, and I don't want to be arrogant about it. It was natural. And my friends who were more literary than I could not figure it out. What is he doing? So these philosophers, Plato, Wittgenstein, Kant, one can't understand Kant. That is the right. But after understanding Sri Aurobindo, you take those concepts as in your stride. It becomes normal. All these great intellectual speculations, no big deal. Come along, we'll go for a joyous walk. So the a priori, understanding of concepts, how we see the world, or whether you take Hobbes, or you take idealism, or you take empiricism, or you take realism. These are all different schools and each fighting with each other. Here Sri Aurobindo takes all of them. Pragmatism. Who was the first pragmatist in Indian philosophy, Indian politics? He drove Swarajya down our throat, literally. Because until then we were all wimps. We will petition the British government, give us some rights, and they would take it and dump it, and we would feel very happy, or they accepted it. We were begging, we were beggars, we were helots. And this is the man who comes and says, this is our right because it is our divine dharma to be free, to be independent. And initially, when he started, no one in India, there was such lethargy in our leaders, in our normal, in our Bhadralok, where our middle class, there was lethargy. We will continue with the colonial power. We will work with them. No, we are not going to work with them. We are going to run our own life. So that clarity, that precision, that force of making things happen, that is pragmatism. That is realism, right? He did yoga not to just become a brahmagyani and withdraw from the world. He only did yoga because he could help his country become free. So, and empiricism, of course, you're observing, you've become totally conscious of what's happening. Empiricism gets absorbed. He swallows all these movements into him so easily. And look at his integral philosophy, right? In right from you take the Vedanta, you take the Brahman, and you take matter, Jada Brahman, and he brings them all together in the life divine. It's such a massive integration of different, even Indian philosophies. He integrated them and brought them into something that was understandable. Until then, what happened? Shankaracharya was the only thing. Universal illusionism. We had withdrawn from life, and here he says, no, no, no. It is not universal illusionism. It is universal realism. Everything is the Brahman. If everything is the Brahman, why are you running away from practical life or pragmatism? So in his own persona, in his own life, he absorbed all these. That is why it becomes easy once you understand him. And that is why what I wanted to show, if someone wants to look at what are we get, whatever the West will say, we'll say, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. If the West says this is a great writer, we'll say yes, this is a great writer. We don't have the inner, the temerity, if I may use the word, or the our own confidence to say this is a great writer in his own standing because he's writing about India and he's Indian. When I compare it, then you understand, oh my God, someone has absorbed all of them in him, not an attempt, intellectual attempt to bring them together, but it is natural to him. So that was my, the way I saw him. And you have brilliantly pointed out in your foreword how Sri S.K. Maitra had done a far deeper job into going into each philosopher, Hegel, Plato. I think he took Gertie, and he took several others, and he showed how vast Sri Aurobindo's vision was. I think it goes much farther, and you write about James. William James, you write about, we haven't even touched evolution, creative evolution, all these philosophies, how he brought evolution and Vedanta together, or Tantra into Vedanta, and that's a higher Tantra. That is his genius, and if we can understand it, it is absolutely, Indians need to become proud of what they have given to the world. They gave it 6,000 years ago. We forgot. We became Macaulites, and we neither remained Indian nor did we become Western. This is an opportunity. This is a grand divine possibility given to us, that we realize who we are. So it's really, he's turning us back to ourselves. Coming back to the COVID, I think it was a blessing, because at the end of it, and I used to wake up at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, unable to breathe, and I said, okay, it's time to check out. I'm ready. I'm okay. And I made peace with everything, and I was comfortable with that. But I would wake up at 2 o'clock, and then I had nothing to do. I'm walking around and trying not to awaken others, and something just kind of broke through. Until then, I had really hesitated in writing about him, and so then I said, just let this be my contribution to the world of appreciating Sri Aurobindo's thought. And that's really, and a lot of energy came from that. Maybe pranic energy, or a lot of vital energy came, and that's came through despite the struggle. with the prana, with the breathing. So that was a gift to me. It is probably one of the most gratifying moments in my own life to have written about the one of the greatest men that India has seen in the last 100 years, and we need to remember him. We need to study what he has done for us.
I think that's a remarkable sharing you've given us, especially your point about prana, because the mother also says that ultimately healing is from within, and whatever medications you may take can only help. It's actually the body and its own pranic energies which heal. So, thank you for that sharing. As you were speaking, I realized that. Just as Sri Krishna synthesized, all the yogas that were available to him in the Bhagavad Gita, and then Sri Aurobindo did that, and he says that in the synthesis of yoga. And if you read the introduction to essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo says exactly that. And this has been our parampara, a kind of Vyasa parampara, where every few years we gather together the key texts, the master texts of a particular tradition and put them together. Now, I think that Dr. Singh, you've also done something very similar. That you've contextualized Sri Aurobindo in a vast canvas, and in a way made him relevant all over again by making him talk to all these different key figures. Because Sri Aurobindo belongs to the whole cosmos. You see, he's a true cosmopolitan, and unfortunately, a part of the Sri Aurobindonian movement, if you want to call it that, though that was not what he intended, but in a way, they get narrower and narrower in their focus. Some people say that we only read Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and after some time they stop reading even Sri Aurobindo because they find it very difficult. Instead, you've reversed the process and you've widened the scope. So I think you've also performed a great synthesis for us of the East and the West and bringing together the best minds in contact with Sri Aurobindo. Now, let me touch on something very, very important that you mentioned, which is that Sri Aurobindo was a pioneer in India's freedom movement because, as everybody knows, in 1907, from behind the scenes, he split the Congress party in the Surat session, where the Garam Dal, the so-called extremist Bal Pal Lal, that is Lala Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandra Pal, and of course Lokmanya Tilak, were the Garam Dal. But behind them was Sri Aurobindo, moving the pieces as a true chess master would. And the Naram Dal were Gokhale and Ranade and Dadabhai Navroji and all these people. And then they split the Congress. But all of this is very important to recall, especially for a younger generation. Sri Aurobindo left politics in 1910 after spending a year in the Alipur jail and went off to Pondicherry and never left. But here's the point. The book is for me extremely auspicious because we are celebrating India at 75, the 75th anniversary of India's independence, which is also Sri Aurobindo's 150th anniversary. So here's one of the best books, in my view, that actually signals the importance of this conjuncture. It's a very rare conjuncture because 75 and 150. This doubling is not going to happen ever, I suppose, because next year India will be 76 and Sri Aurobindo will be 151. So that doubling, that exact half, it's like the half life, of colonialism, because colonialism was about 150, 200 years. And Sri Aurobindo was the great prophet of Indian nationalism. This is, in a way, the title of Dr. Karan Singh's book. And now let us, come to the, the future, because you are calling this book Sri Aurobindo in India's Literary Renaissance. And Sri Aurobindo wrote this great book called The Future Poetry, where he talks about how the poetry of the future may return to the mantra. See, because the mantra combined, all aspects of literary composition. It was sound, vibration, rhythm, meaning. It had beauty. So and it had meaning at many, many levels. But for us Hindus, mantras were also action syllables. In other words, you could utter a mantra, and you mentioned about supreme realism, because when you say Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam, that means everything that is seen and unseen, manifest and unmanifest, pervades the spirit, the divine spirit pervades everything. So we are supreme realists, and even Shankara, I might say, is misinterpreted
Yes.
because he doesn't say it's Mayavad, he says it's Adhyasa. Anyhow, so my point is, as supreme realists and as supreme pragmatists, do you think that the renaissance of India is actually complete, or is it only halfway, or have we done only one half of it? And really, my question to you is, what role does literature have? And more broadly speaking, what role do letters, or what role do does philosophy and the humanities have? Because I live in India, and in a sense, India always looks rosier from afar. But today nobody cares about humanities. Unfortunately, our competence in languages in India is decreasing alarmingly, and you and I have talked about it. Do you really believe that we can go to a mantric poetry when poetry itself is dying, and we are now become, not even literati or chatterati, but twitterati? So my question to you is: one, is the Renaissance of India uh, halfway, or where are we there? Are we really going to blossom as Sri Aurobindo wanted? And he wrote extensively about it in a book called The Renaissance in India, and of course in Foundations of Indian Culture. And if you think, as I do, that yes, we are going to have a incredible flourishing of Indic civilization all over again, then my question to you is, what role will literature, letters, philosophy, and humanities play in this?
Well, today, look behind you. You're the pictures behind you, and I think I saw one, maybe Sri Krishna and Radha, if maybe on the side when the camera was moving. And do you realize that a lot of people believe that Sri Krishna and Radha were not real figures, and I don't have any problems with that. When Geet Govinda was written, I think in the 12th century, 13th century, look at the impact it has on our entire civilization. You go to any corner of India, you will find Radha Krishna in some way or the other, whether it's sculpture, whether it's painting, whether it's music, whether it's in the temples, whether it's on our clothes printed on us, whether people meditating. The power, look at the power of the Vedas. Today, we are here as if there is what unites India today. It is something some great people 6,000, 8,000 years ago discovered. And that is the essence. With all this diversity of India and all these cycles, these yugas that India has gone through, something essential holds us together. Which is what dharma really means, that which holds us together. So I think the Indian Renaissance has barely begun. If you look at the European Renaissance, 15th century, it's not over. It's still continuing in our life today. That classicism, the Greek, the Latin classicism that came through, spread with the books, the Gutenberg. Then you have Newton and you have Copernicus and Galileo, and then a tremendous efflorescence of art in Florence, appropriately named. And you had some of the greatest artists and writers and people questioning it. That is what created the Renaissance, which is still impacting us, right? It is not over. So the Indian Renaissance, for any Renaissance to begin, first a sense of political freedom, individual freedom, which is what began. That's why it started in Florence, because the Medicis were there. There was relative freedom. Then the second thing is realization of one's dharma. And the European mind was so influenced by Greek and Latin dharma that it absorbed it. It was not the only strain, but the ability to have humanism, man as the center of the world, realizing the dignity of man, questioning papal authority or questioning the king, the royal authority. Suddenly, man became important as because man is the creator, the artist. Man can change things. So that humanism is the dharma of Europe. India started realizing its own dharma. And India's dharma is different. It's a little deeper. It's bigger, but it's more confusing because it's so much bigger. So I submit to you that India's renaissance has barely begun. What Sri Aurobindo did put a seed there, kind of a flame seed in us, in the nation, in the soil of the nation. And this is the power of a yogi. He leaves something there, and it ages will take to express what he did. Right? What Sri Ramakrishna envisaged. He says all religions, they may look different, but there is one reality behind it. Now we are still discovering that, and anytime the spirituality is figured out, which will be the true oneness of the earth, will when we realize our inherent spirituality. So think about it. He's gone. He went in 1885. We are still trying to live that. Swami Vivekananda, his vision of India, we are still trying to live that. So I believe Indian Renaissance has begun, has barely begun. We have so many exciting things happening. Yes, there will be a lull. Education is a problem, as you know. Humanities, nobody pays attention to. But who will awaken to this? Well, if it is the 150th year, if it is the 75th year, then those who understand, those who love to write, those who share, right? A writer um, is as important as a martyr on the battlefield. I mean, that is one of the ancient sayings. So the power of the pen cannot be is as mighty or mightier than the sword. And literature is the way, is the means to transform the awareness. Yes, it'll have a trickle down effect. As Ezra Pound said, the writers and the poets are the antennae of the nation. So who will pick up all the new vibrations? Who will pick up the new things happening? Who will transmit these vibrations? It is the authors, the poets, the thinkers, the philosophers. So just as the European Renaissance has not ended, our Renaissance has not ended. It will continue. It may be subterranean, subaltern. We may not see it. It may get dissipated. Modern Indian poetry kind of went off on a segue, but that too is probably needed, and that too will come back. You see, in the US, in UK, after Eliot, we went into vers libre, free verse, and then now what? The form poetry has come back roaring, and Eliot as a critic has kind of disappeared. As a poet, he is still acknowledged as a great poet. As a critic, he has been beaten down so much by Harold Bloom and their ilk that we don't appreciate Eliot as a critic anymore. So these will come and go, but something fundamental was picked up by Sri Aurobindo, and that is important in literary criticism. See, the future poetry is, and it's interesting. It is only one aspect of his literary criticism. It's a great work, but it's only one aspect. His quantitative poetry, his experiments in meter, that's another great contribution in prosody. His bhashya on the Gita, his linguistic analysis of the Vedas and the translation of the Upanishads. And again, bringing Ezra Pound, every translation is a literary criticism. So every time he translated the three most important Shrutis of India, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Gita, he made them again available to us because we had forgotten what they meant. That was the scandal of the Vedas. We were told that the Vedas are the babblings of a primitive people by Max Mueller. This is a great nation. I love this nation, but the Vedas are babblings of a primitive humanity. Well, no, we don't think so. And when Sri Aurobindo shows that, going to the root of the word, going to the prosody, going to deep linguistic analysis, we realize that this literary criticism is so far ahead, and now we are beginning to catch up. Remember, when we started understanding the history of languages, the Indo-Aryan languages, guess which language was the most important when it was studied? It was Sanskrit, because the roots and the sounds were still pure. And so Sri Aurobindo studied that, and beautiful analysis. And I think the Aryan culture, if you remember that essay written by him, it was an amazing work of combining analysis, scholarly approach with a deep understanding of the culture because he lived it. So this was not a colonialism of literature, as Venuti talks about. This was a reversal of the colonialism, and that is his greatest contribution as a critic.
When you were speaking, I was going to ask you, is that why you started a publishing house? Because you still have faith in the power of literature and the power of ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, that is our power. And, we've been blessed by some great people in India. So honestly, I would love to take the credit. But in all honesty, I take no credit. The team in India has done this amazing work. And the goal is to bring new thoughts, new ideas. The blue one. See, I found this T-shirt. I mean, talk about coincidence. I found this T-shirt this morning, and I said,
I,
"This is
I, I
appropriate."
need I need one too. I need one too. No, so
Yeah.
so viewers, I want to show you, as I've
Yes.
done earlier, this book looks as if it's actually been published by Sri Aurobindo Ashram. For a moment when I got it, actually they've done exactly that sort of design, and inside there's a slightly off white yellow type paper, thick paper, and it's been printed in one of the best printing houses. So it's a very well produced book, and I urge you all to acquire copies, because books are not accessories. Okay, you have to purchase a book and read it, and there's nothing like reading a book uh, by holding it in your hands. I mean, one reads books. I too read books on an iPad or whatever, but it's a nice feel. So congratulations to the whole team of Blue One, Anirudh ji, Pankaj ji, and everyone else in your team on this great achievement. And I hope the publishing house, which has also published a book on integral education by Partho ji, it's a great book because he's really done this all his life. I would
Yes.
recommend that book as well. I wish he could join us, but perhaps later in another conversation. Now, to get back to this book, my question to you, we've talked about this sometime, but when literary modernism acquired traction in India, it was only after the war, the Second World War ended, because there was a time lag. Paper was in short supply. There were some very early modernists, including a poet whom we've forgotten, Shahid Sohrawardi.
Yes.
Not Shahid Sohrawardi, the man who was the chief minister of Bengal and so forth, a cousin of his, you know. And he studied in England, and between the war, he was writing poems in this modernist fashion. And Nissim Ezekiel is considered the first Indian modernist. He was scrubbing decks on a ship to England just after the war ended, and he picked up that culture. Whereas the older poets like Sarojini Naidu, who are forgotten and ridiculed, in fact, she was the one who gave the Fenolosa papers to Ezra Pound.
That's right.
She knew Yeats personally. Anyhow, my question to you is, when uh, Nissim Ezekiel is hailed as the father of Indian literary modernism, he comes up with this amazing classification. He says, I divide all readers of poetry into those who can appreciate Sri Aurobindo and those who can't. And then he says, I belong to the latter, and I want to have nothing to do with the former. So you've got a series of anthologies which are more and more and more exclusive. 10 Indian poets by Mehrotra, then another one by Parthasarthi. Rather, Parthasarthi had 10, Mehrotra had 14, Keki Daruwala, Pritesh Nandi, all of these people were anthologists. Salim Piradina, hundreds of these anthologies came out, and they all excluded the greatest poet in English that India has produced, Sri Aurobindo. Savitri is 24,000 lines long. And, I had to step in with an anthology trying to bridge this gulf. So, how do you think we should go about ending the schizophrenia of the Indian literary mind, especially post 1950? What should we do?
I think we should talk about the poetry. We should bring it out. Let's take a look at it. See, the best way, again, Ezra Pound, you don't talk about a work of art. You just show the work of art. This is the work of art. It's like saying, okay, there are two kinds of readers. One loves Shakespeare and the other doesn't, and I belong to the latter. Are you, I mean, do I need to say anything after that? Who is the greatest philosopher in the last 150 years? The greatest literary critic, the contributions, aphorisms, the greatest writer of letters, or lettereteer, if you may use the pun, right? The one who attempted new kind of plays, the one who attempted a new kind of story. Did Nissim Ezekiel, you look at his collection of books, and Nissim Ezekiel is beaten up by A.K. Mehrotra. If you look at really, his work will be forgotten. And for once, I agree with A.K. Mehrotra. For once, he's right. Because this is a very narrow approach. It's called realism. He'll describe the outside circumstances. There is no sense of rhythm, no sense of beauty, and all his approach is either talk about breasts or genitals. And if that is your approach about poetry, then I'm glad that you're in the second group and you stay in that second group. So the way art is to be appreciated is, here it is. Here, take a look. You like it or you don't. Tagore said it. When Tagore got the Nobel Prize, people said, how great a poet you are. He says, I'm still the same poet. The people who have been judged today is not the poet, but the judges. It is the judges who have shown what they appreciate. So I think, I don't take it to heart. These people come and go. This is static. People, you just ignore it. You do look at the excellence in art. If you read his poetry, spread, listen to it, whether it's audio, listen to the sound of the poetry. He has created a new meter in English. Read Baji Prabhu. Has anyone read what a tremendous contribution it is in blank verse? You might call it, it is not Tennysonian, it is not Keatsian, it is not like Shelley. He has created something different. Yes, it's a limited area. You may not be able to do too much with that kind of rugged, stark, rocky, pun intended poetry. But what an amazing piece of work. Yes, it's a minor work, but it's an amazing piece of work. His sonnets, his contribution, Nirvana sonnet itself, what an amazing. I would put it among the 10 best sonnets ever that have been written. Whether it's Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Tennyson, you can match Nirvana as a sonnet. Look at it as a work of art. Forget even the meaning. Look at the work of art. Look at the sound he has created. And who is more modern than him? He's talking about the sound of an auto rickshaw in a nirvanic experience. I mean, what realism do you want? And what is realism after all? Is realism only looking at slums and describing how the person is shoving flowers in the armpit of the idol of Kali? I mean, is that what we are? Is that, if that's okay? If that is what the poet wants, but it shows a very limited scholarly approach. It shows a very limited worldview. When R. Parthasarathi says in his introduction, and I allude to his book, that we don't know if the past literature has any meaning. You definitely know that you cannot take him seriously because he's past literature now. So I don't know if his literature has any meaning. That means the only literature that has meaning today is this work, because this is present. You see, that is not a scholarly approach to literature. Again, as you said, to contextualize. Where in the vast canon of English literature, of Indian literature, does Sri Aurobindo or any other poet, how can they be seen? How do you put them in that big, large frame of reference? So to me, he is in the tradition of Veda Vyasa. He's in the tradition of Sri Krishna. He's in the tradition of a Shakespeare. Now, you may disagree. Then let's have a proper literary discussion. But to criticize him, to say, oh, his epic is like the dhoti or the sari, then that is not criticism.
Matthew
That
Arnold in the sari.
Matthew Arnold. No, Keki Daruwala said this is like a sari that keeps unrolling. Well,
Oh.
then if you are in a lungi yourself, Keki, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, this is the level of criticism that we have, and that is the problem. It is not the literature that has gone down. It is the criticism that has gone down. Once we elevate the level of criticism, I guarantee you, there are great poets and writers in India today who just need to be to be brought up and nurtured, and maybe even nurtured is a bad word, who just need to be brought attention to. They just need to be brought out. And translations, we don't translate ourselves. If we just do these basic things, education, if we make art, literature fun, then it will be worthwhile. As Pritish Nandi said, one good thing, one, is when you have poetry with a guitar, then poetry will have impact. And I agree with him. That's what we need to do.
I think you've touched on a number of very important points. In fact, I want to disagree with you on Nissim Ezekiel. Of all the modernists, he had the greatest, I think, personal spiritual quest, as is evident in Hymns in
Yes.
Darkness and Latter day Psalms. So, in Hymns in Darkness, he engages with the Upanishads
Yes.
through a kind of translation. And Latter day Psalms, he engages with his Jewish past and
Yes, he
looks at
does.
Psalms and rewrites them. And again, you mentioned Parthasarathi. It's interesting. He stopped writing poetry. And what does he do? He translates the Shilapadikaram. He goes
Yes.
back to ancient Tamil Sangam literature. So I think the important thing is you can't get rid of the past. If you're a modernist, great modernists like Eliot went back to Dante.
That's right.
See, wasteland is nothing but waiting for the waters of spirituality
That's right.
to flow once again. Which
That's
brings
right.
me to our concluding portion here. We are almost out of time, which is, when you look at India's poetic genius, of course, we had great Kavya literature, like Kalidasa, so beautiful, so mellifluous. We
Yes.
had great erotic poetry, Gatha Shaptashati of Hala, and Prakrit poetry, love songs in Tamil, very terse, very beautiful Sangam literature of Aham and Puram, and a variety. We wrote history in poetry.
Yes.
Rajatarangini is a kavya, but most people would say, and of course we have Mahakavyas like Ramayana, Mahabharata, but I'm saying that most people would say that India's poetic genius was spiritual. Though we wrote
Yes.
medical treatises and we wrote mathematical treatises like Leelavati, we wrote astronomy and poetry. Poetry was so versatile, Sanskrit poetry. But I think our genius was spiritual. And I think in all of modern times, I can't think of, and certainly modern Indian literature in English, in our Indian languages, Tagore's poetry is deeply spiritual. And in Subramanyam Bharati's poetry in Tamil, and we have a lot of people. So the so-called Renaissance of India was not only about Indian independence and freedom from the British, it was also a reconnection with our ancient spiritual genius, which is the genius of Sanatan Dharma. And
Yes.
you mentioned the gatekeepers of Indian English poetry. But we have gatekeepers everywhere today, and they want to tell us that somehow, our civilization, because it's spiritual, is superstitious. So, my real question to you is, do you think that, there is any scope for a spiritual renaissance in India, in which literature will play a major role? Because as you know, people like us, we can open any page of Savitri and meditate on 4 lines, and you'll immediately see that there's an elevation of consciousness that Sri Aurobindo's writings will induce in us. And those who have experienced it can vouch for it. Look at the poem, Rose of God. Now, rose is typically a Western symbol, whereas the lotus is an Indian symbol. But I think this poem, if you ask me, it's really a poem to the mother, because the mother is the rose of God. Because remember, the rose originally was Mary, the mother of God,
That's
you
right.
see.
That's right.
So Notre Dame, there's a rose everywhere. So
That's right.
look at the genius of Sri Aurobindo, because you see the spiritual age to come is not East versus West, man versus woman, man versus God, man versus nature, man versus man, the Freudian schizophrenia. No, it's a great integral push. And I think that you have contributed to this, Dr. Singh, because what you have done is like you've made It's like Sri Aurobindo with the guitar. You made him so readable. Even children can read your chapters and say, wow, this is neat. I didn't know this. Or, you know, randomly one can read, a chapter, and you've made Sri Aurobindo so accessible, so readable for a new generation. So it's a great service that you have actually performed. But let's end with this question. How do you make spirituality accessible?
I'll give you, the only thing I know is to make it accessible, one must become spiritual oneself. There is no other way that I know of. You can never change. It's hard enough to change oneself, right? To grow. So changing others, changing others is a Western concept. That's the the way to convert people to your religion, and sign them up for the new club, and give a little money, and now you say this prayer. But the depth of understanding of what is true, the esoteric religion, the esotericism, that is not understood. So the way to spread spirituality is to become spiritual. The mother actually said something very beautiful about it. People said, how can we transform India? And she had a beautiful answer that really cuts to the core for me. Says, find your heart, find your psychic. You start living in that, you'll start transforming India immediately. And there's a very good book, Zero Limits. You might have heard about it. The practice of Ho'oponopono in Hawaii. The healer does not try to change the patient. The healer changes himself. Healer apologizes for all the garbage he's carrying, all the psychological formations, all the pain, the anger, the suffering, and he heals himself of that, and the patient starts healing. Something happens immediately to the patient. So I think that's what we have to do. We have to understand that Sri Aurobindo is as a prophet of something new. We have to see ourselves beyond any limitation, whether it's the limitation of religion or denomination or language or nation. These are the limitations, and the moment we can, if one person can free himself or herself, that impact spreads, right? One man's perfection can still save the world, as he said. And a beautiful line. What a beautiful understanding. I absolutely, I know time is running out, and I absolutely love talking to you. We can go on for hours, and maybe next time I should be asking you questions about this book, because there's so much to learn from you. And we are humble students who have had one of the greatest teachers of all time. And I see behind you amazing teachers. I think it's Sri Ramana Maharshi, another amazing teacher, and other great yogis. So I think in that tradition, if we just understand who we truly are, that itself is the beginning. And if we start studying them and holding them in our dharana, and just trying to live with that purity. These people had such purity. If each of us just did that, immediately things will change. That is my faith, and that's what we're going to live by. And something beautiful Sri Aurobindo said, and we need to remember that when he was talking to youngsters. And just one moment, his one of his most quoted speeches: "Suffer that your country may rejoice." That hits hard. He does not say, succeed, become prosperous. He tells the youngsters, die that she may live, suffer that she may rejoice. And so that is the amazing purity of these people who did not fear about their own life, their own success. They gave up everything. And if we can just hold even a drop of that pure gold in our awareness, I think everything will happen.
I think that's a fantastic note on which to end our session. I can only reiterate what you said, that in India, it's not an outside in way of transforming, it's an inside out way. And as Swami Vivekananda said, this is not an age of individual withdrawal from the world and liberation. This is a time for spreading the spiritual light everywhere, the sadharanikaran of this higher consciousness. And the earth is receptive, and we all have to play our role. And as you said, we must start living as if we have no limitations. Even the body is not a limitation, let alone the mind. And when we can spend even a few moments in that limitless consciousness of the infinite Sat Chit Ananda, I think we will actually experience the core of Sri Aurobindo and his great legacy, the works like a modern Veda that he has left for all of us. And I want to thank you for once again making this modern Veda accessible to us, and for inviting yet another generation to, like in a tirtha, to dip into it and emerge refreshed, healed, and renewed as you yourself were. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you very much. And I wish this book, as well as the new publishing house, a wonderful onward journey. Thank you.
Thank you.